Hello, and welcome to the Sleepy Mind. Tonight, we are going somewhere high. Not dramatically high, not in the way of expeditions and equipment and the thin, urgent air of a summit push. Somewhere high in a different sense. The kind of height that has drawn people away from the noise of the valleys for more than 2,000 years. The kind that asks something of you simply by the effort of reaching it, and offers something in return that is difficult to name and easy to feel. Mountains and monasteries have belonged to each other for as long as human beings have sought to understand what the mind actually is when it is left alone long enough to show itself. There is something about a high place that the contemplative traditions understood early and have never stopped returning to. The air is thinner, the sky is closer, the sounds that fill ordinary life fall away below the tree line, and what remains is a quality of silence that is not empty but full, not absence but presence of a different and quieter kind. This is not a life of drama. The monks who have lived in these places, on stone floors in the cold dark before dawn, wrapped in robes against the mountain wind, were not seekers of extremity for its own sake. They were, and are, people who found that the ordinary business of a human mind, its restlessness, its noise, its endless conversation with itself, became considerably easier to see clearly when a mountain stood between them and the rest of the world. And yet the mountain is never truly a wall. It is more like a frame. It holds the life inside it in a particular quality of attention, the way a deep valley holds morning mist, not forever, but long enough to be inhabited. Even now, as you listen, somewhere above the clouds, a butter lamp is burning in a stone hall. A bell has just sounded across a courtyard where frost is still settling on the flagstones. Someone is sitting quietly, awake before the sun, in a place that has been held in that same stillness for hundreds of years. If these slow journeys into sleep bring you something worth returning to, I would love for you to like this video or subscribe to The Sleepy Mind. It helps more tired and curious minds find their way here, one quiet night at a time. But for now, there is nothing to do and nowhere to be. Let your body settle into wherever it is resting. Let your shoulders drop gently away from your ears. Let your hands become still. And let your eyes, if they are still open, grow a little heavier with each breath, the way the sky above a mountain grows heavier with dusk, slowly, without effort, until the stars simply arrive. We are going somewhere high and quiet and very, very old tonight. Let's begin. There is a question worth sitting with before anything else. A quiet question that does not demand an immediate answer, but simply opens a space for one to arrive. Why here? Of all the places a human being might choose to spend a life in practice, to dedicate years or decades to the patient work of understanding the nature of the mind, why would so many choose a mountain? Why would they carry their robes and their bowls and their few possessions up slopes that offer nothing comfortable, nothing convenient, and nothing easy, and then stay? The answer is not simple, and the traditions that built these places were not simple people. They were precise, they were practical, and the choice of a mountain location was, in almost every case, a considered one, arrived at through a combination of spiritual understanding, ecological necessity, and a quality of accumulated wisdom about what the human mind actually needs in order to become still. In many Buddhist traditions, The Tibetan word for monastery carries this understanding inside it from the beginning. The word is gompa, and it translates, with a kind of spare accuracy, as a place of meditation in solitude. Not a place of community alone, though community is essential. Not a place of learning alone, though learning is central. A place where solitude and meditation are the organizing conditions, and where everything else, the buildings, the bells, the daily routines, the relationships, serves those two things. Mountains, it turned out, were among the most reliable providers of both. The practical advantages were real and were understood clearly. A monastery placed above the populated valleys was protected from the constant movement of ordinary life, the traffic of commerce and conversation, and social obligation that made sustained inner work genuinely difficult to maintain. At altitude, the world's noise did not simply diminish. It fell away with a completeness that lower elevations could not produce. The practitioner who climbed to a mountain monastery was not escaping the world in any final sense. They were gaining a perspective on it that the world, seen from inside itself, could not offer. Water was a necessity, and mountains provided it reliably in the form of springs and snowmelt, streams that ran clear through all but the driest months, and that could be channeled with patience and skill into the monastery's daily needs. The coolness of altitude made long hours of seated practice physically more comfortable than the heat of the plains below, particularly in the summer months when the valleys became difficult and the mountain air remained mild and clear. Defense mattered too, in periods when political instability made the safety of buildings and manuscripts and communities a genuine concern. A monastery on a mountain ridge required an attacker to approach it visibly, across terrain that exhausted the body and exposed the approach. Many communities survived centuries of upheaval in the regions below them, simply by virtue of the altitude that placed them beyond easy reach. But these were practical considerations, and the traditions that built these monasteries understood something beyond the practical. In Chinese Buddhist tradition, the four great sacred mountains of Wutaishan, Emeshan, Juhuashan, and Putuoshan were each understood as the dwelling place of a specific bodhisattva, an awakened being whose compassionate presence infused the landscape itself. To build a monastery on such a mountain was not merely to occupy a convenient location. It was to place a community of practice inside a field of awakened intention that the mountain already carried. Wutaishan in Shanxi province, associated with Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom, who is depicted holding a flaming sword that cuts through conceptual confusion, has been a center of Buddhist learning and practice since the 1st century of the Common Era. That is nearly 2,000 years of continuous monastic presence on a single mountain. The knowledge, the practice, the lineages of teaching that have passed through those valleys, generation by generation, constitute something that no flat and accessible location could have sustained through the same span of time with the same integrity. In Sri Lanka, long before stone was cut and mortar mixed, individual practitioners sought out the caves and rock overhangs of the island's central highlands, retreating into the mountain's own architecture rather than building their own. Cave monasteries carved into mountainsides have been recorded in Sri Lanka since the 3rd century before the Common Era, making them among the earliest permanent monastic dwellings anywhere in the Buddhist world. The mountain offered shelter before it offered symbolism, and that original intimacy with the rock, the coolness of the stone against the back, the sound of rain on an overhang, the view of the valley floor far below, remained part of the tradition's understanding of what practice in a mountain place actually felt like. In Japan, the monk Kukai, who brought the Shingon school of Buddhism from China in the early 9th century, chose for his monastery's permanent home a mountain plateau surrounded by 8 distinct peaks whose configuration reminded him of an open lotus flower. The place was Mount Koya, Koya-san, and the choice was not incidental. The lotus in Buddhist iconography is the symbol of practice itself, the flower that rises from muddy water into clear air without being stained by the mud it passes through. To settle a monastery inside a natural lotus was to embed the institution in a landscape that was already teaching the central lesson of the tradition before a single student had arrived. The mountains, in other words, were not a backdrop. They were not scenery placed behind the real action. They were understood as participants, as presences with their own qualities and their own contributions to the work of practice. And that understanding, carried consistently across traditions as different from one another as Theravada Sri Lanka and Shingon Japan and Vajrayana Tibet, suggests something worth pausing to consider. Something about high places that the contemplative mind, when it pays close enough attention, has always recognized. It is into one of those high places, one of those mountains chosen with care and inhabited with patience over many centuries, that we are now beginning to move. To build on a mountain is to accept a set of constraints that building on level ground does not impose. There is no ready supply of flat land. There is no easy delivery of materials. There is no margin for error in a structure that must stand against wind speeds and snow loads and temperature fluctuations that would test the limits of any architect working with modern tools and contemporary understanding of materials. And yet, the monasteries that were built in mountain locations across Asia are not merely structurally adequate. They are, in many cases, among the most beautiful and precisely considered buildings ever made by human hands. The achievement is easier to appreciate when you understand what it required. Stone for the walls had to be quarried from the mountain itself or carried from lower elevations by human porters and pack animals over paths that in many cases were little more than ledges cut into steep rock faces. Timber for roofing, for floors, for the carved screens and door frames that give the interiors their warmth and elaboration, had to be felled at lower altitudes and hauled upward by the same slow means. Every beam, every threshold stone, every roof tile arrived at the building site, having already crossed a mountain. The result was a set of architectural traditions that developed in intimate relationship with their constraints, finding in limitation a kind of creative precision that more generously provisioned building traditions sometimes lack. Tibetan monastery architecture developed the massive battered wall, thick at the base and tapering toward the top, that gives these buildings their characteristic trapezoidal profile and their appearance of growing directly from the rock beneath them. These walls were not merely aesthetically distinctive. They distributed the weight of heavy snowfall and absorbed the horizontal forces of mountain wind in ways that the more vertical walls of lowland construction could not manage at altitude. The color of a Tibetan monastery's walls tells a story that those with knowledge of the tradition can read from a considerable distance. White walls with red and ochre horizontal bands near the roofline indicate, in the traditional coding of Tibetan Buddhist architecture, the particular school of practice housed within. The Gelugpa school, founded by the reforming master Tsongkhapa in the 14th century, is associated with yellow. The Kagyupa school, whose lineage of meditation masters produced Milarepa, favors red. The Nyingmapa school, the oldest of the Tibetan Buddhist schools, uses deep red ochre in its characteristic color scheme. A monastery's walls announce its lineage the way a flag announces a nation, quietly and from a distance, to anyone who knows how to look. Drepung Monastery, built on a hillside outside Lhasa in the 15th century, and at one period the largest monastic institution in the world, housing upward of 10,000 monks, was constructed in fulfillment of a vision attributed to its founder. In that vision, the arrangement of white buildings across the slope of the hill would resemble, when seen from the valley below, a pile of white rice. The Tibetan name Drepung means precisely this, a heap or mound of rice, that most basic and sustaining of foods, rendered in stone and whitewash on a mountain's face, as an act of teaching about abundance and offering that had nothing to do with words. In Bhutan, the fortress monastery, called a dzong, evolved a form that served simultaneously as a center of Buddhist practice, a seat of regional government, and a military stronghold. The Paro Dzong, the Punakha Dzong, the Trongsa Dzong. Each of these buildings occupies its mountain or riverine position with a confidence that is architectural and spiritual simultaneously. Massive walls and carefully proportioned interior courtyards, creating a sequence of spaces that move the visitor from the exposed outer world into progressively more sheltered and more sacred interiors, the building itself enacting the journey from distraction to concentration. Among all the mountain monasteries of the world, Taktsang Palphug in Bhutan, known in the West as the Tiger's Nest, presents perhaps the most extraordinary argument for the combination of faith and engineering skill that mountain monastery construction required. Built into a cliff face at approximately 3,120 meters above sea level, with parts of its structure cantilevered over a sheer drop of nearly 900 meters, it occupies the cave where the 8th century teacher Padmasambhava, known in Tibetan as Guru Rinpoche, is said to have meditated for 3 months, having arrived there on the back of a tigress who was herself a manifestation of his consort. The monastery built around that cave, first constructed in the 17th century and rebuilt after a fire in 1998, seems less to cling to the cliff than to grow from it, as if the stone of the building and the stone of the mountain recognized each other and agreed to hold together. Water supply, that most basic necessity of any permanent human settlement, was for mountain monasteries an engineering challenge that required ingenuity and patience in roughly equal measure. Many communities developed systems of stone channels and cisterns that captured spring water and directed it through the monastery complex with a precision that ensured continuous supply even through dry seasons. Some of these systems, built without metal pipes or mechanical fittings, using only shaped stone and the patient knowledge of how water moves under gravity, have remained functional for several centuries. They are among the most quietly impressive achievements of mountain monastery construction, invisible to the casual visitor, but essential to everything the more visible buildings contain. The Meteora monasteries of central Greece, though belonging to the Eastern Orthodox Christian tradition rather than to Buddhism, stand as evidence that the impulse to build places of practice on inaccessible heights is not confined to any single religious heritage. 6 monasteries perched atop naturally formed sandstone pillars rising up to 400 meters from the valley floor. Their name derived from the Greek word for things suspended in the air or in the heavens. Before the 20th century cut staircases into the rock. The only way to reach them was by rope ladder or by being hauled upward in a large net by a hand-operated winch, a method of access that was not an inconvenience to be engineered away, but a deliberate threshold, a physical commitment required of anyone wishing to enter. In every case, the architecture of the mountain monastery is inseparable from the mountain itself. The buildings did not arrive at their locations and impose themselves on the landscape. They grew from it, slowly, over centuries, shaped by the stone they stood on and the sky they rose into, until the distinction between what was built and what was already there became difficult to hold clearly. And that difficulty, it turns out, is not a problem to be solved. It is part of what these places are trying to say. Long before monasteries were built on mountains, the mountains themselves were understood as sacred. Not sacred in the sense of being set apart for ritual use, but sacred in the more fundamental sense of being places where the ordinary and the extraordinary met, where the human and the cosmic were in closer proximity than they were in the valleys below. This understanding appears with a consistency that crosses the boundaries of culture and tradition, wherever human beings have lived in sight of high peaks. At the center of Buddhist and Hindu cosmology alike stands a mountain that has never been climbed, because it does not exist in the world of physical geography. Mount Meru, the axis of the universe, the dwelling place of gods, and the pivot around which all of existence turns, is the cosmological mountain against which all real mountains are understood as reflections or expressions. In Buddhist iconography, the mandala, that intricate circular diagram used as a meditation support and as a map of awakened reality, places Mount Meru at its center, the surrounding continents and oceans arranged around it with a precision that mirrors the organization of the universe itself. When Tibetan architects designed the stupa, the dome-shaped monument that is among the most characteristic structures of Buddhist sacred architecture, they were building a 3-dimensional mandala with Meru at its core. The different tiers of the stupa correspond to different levels of the cosmological universe, and the whole structure enacts, in stone and gold and plaster, the ascent from the base of existence toward its open summit. A stupa on a mountain is therefore not merely a building on a slope. It is a cosmological map placed on top of a cosmological reality, the human understanding of the sacred echoing and amplifying what the mountain was already saying. Mount Kailash in western Tibet stands at the intersection of 4 of the world's great spiritual traditions, a convergence without precedent in the world's sacred geography. For practitioners of Bon, the indigenous Tibetan tradition that predates Buddhism's arrival in the region, Kailash is the sole mountain of the entire world, the axis around which all spiritual power turns. For Tibetan Buddhists, it is the abode of the meditational deity Chakrasamvara, whose mandala the mountain physically embodies. For Hindus, it is the dwelling place of Shiva, the great ascetic god who sits in perpetual meditation on its slopes. For Jains, It is the place where the first Tirthankara, the founding teacher of their tradition, attained liberation. What is remarkable about Kailash is not merely that 4 traditions regard it as sacred, though that alone is worth pausing over. What is remarkable is that no mountaineering expedition has ever reached its summit. The mountain has been approached and studied and circumambulated by millions of pilgrims over many centuries, and legal restrictions on climbing currently prevent attempts. But the deeper truth is that among all those who have come close to Kailash, there has been a consistent recognition that reaching the summit is not the point. The mountain is not a problem to be solved. It is a presence to be received. The annual circumambulation of Kailash, the Kora as it is called in Tibetan, covers approximately 52 kilometers and is completed by most pilgrims over 3 days. The path crosses a high pass at approximately 5,630 meters above sea level, and in the course of the walk, the pilgrim traverses 4 distinct faces of the mountain, each associated with a different Buddhist tradition and a different quality of experience. Some pilgrims, whose devotion or whose understanding of the practice has reached a particular depth, complete the entire circumambulation by prostrating, lying full length on the ground, rising, taking 1 step forward, and lying down again for the entire 52 kilometers. This form of the Kora can take several weeks. It is not understood as an extreme act. It is understood as an appropriate response to what the mountain is. The sacred mountain is not uniquely Himalayan. Sri Pada, the peak in the highland centre of Sri Lanka known in the West as Adam's Peak, holds at its summit a rock formation that has been venerated for many centuries and continues to draw pilgrims from 4 separate religious traditions. Buddhists understand it as the footprint left by the Buddha on his 3rd visit to Sri Lanka. Hindus regard it as the footprint of Shiva. Muslims and some Christians understand it as the footprint of Adam, placed there at the moment of his descent from paradise. 4 interpretations, 1 mark in the rock, on a mountain that thousands of pilgrims climb through the night each year to reach at dawn. In Japan, Mount Fuji has been a pilgrimage destination since at least the 7th century, its near-perfect conical form visible across a vast area of the Kanto Plain, and understood within Shinto belief as the physical body of a deity. The climbing of Fuji is itself a religious act, and small shrines mark the route from base to summit, each one a stopping point where the climber's relationship with the mountain is renewed and deepened. In the modern period, millions of people climb Fuji each year, many of them without any specifically religious intention, drawn simply by the form of the mountain and the quality of experience that its ascent provides. The sacred and the secular have found a way of sharing the same path. In the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, the oldest of the Tibetan Buddhist schools, certain mountains are understood as the dwelling places of powerful protective deities called Yulla, or land gods, whose relationship with the local human community is one of mutual obligation and care. The correct relationship with these mountain deities requires regular offerings, the observance of behavioral codes specific to the local landscape, and a quality of attention to the natural world that is, in practical terms, a form of ecological mindfulness refined over many centuries into precise and detailed knowledge. These traditions of sacred geography, spread across cultures and centuries and separated by vast distances of land and sea, point towards something consistent enough to be worth noting. The mountain has always been, for the contemplative mind, more than a physical object. It has been a presence, a teacher, a place where the ordinary scales of human concern are held in a perspective that only height and distance and the quality of mountain silence can provide. Long before monasteries were built on mountains, the mountains themselves were understood as sacred. Not sacred in the sense of being set apart for ritual use, but sacred in the more fundamental sense of being places where the ordinary and the extraordinary met, where the human and the cosmic were in closer proximity than they were in the valleys below. This understanding appears with a consistency that crosses the boundaries of culture and tradition wherever human beings have lived in sight of high peaks. At the center of Buddhist and Hindu cosmology alike stands a mountain that has never been climbed because it does not exist in the world of physical geography. Mount Meru, the axis of the universe, the dwelling place of gods, and the pivot around which all of existence turns, is the cosmological mountain against which all real mountains are understood as reflections or expressions. In Buddhist iconography, the mandala, that intricate circular diagram used as a meditation support and as a map of awakened reality, places Mount Meru at its center, the surrounding continents and oceans arranged around it, with a precision that mirrors the organization of the universe itself. When Tibetan architects designed the stupa, the dome-shaped monument that is among the most characteristic structures of Buddhist sacred architecture, they were building a three-dimensional mandala with Meru at its core. The different tiers of the stupa correspond to different levels of the cosmological universe, and the whole structure enacts, in stone and gold and plaster, the ascent from the base of existence toward its open summit. A stupa on a mountain is therefore not merely a building on a slope. It is a cosmological map placed on top of a cosmological reality, the human understanding of the sacred echoing and amplifying what the mountain was already saying. Mount Kailash in western Tibet stands at the intersection of four of the world's great spiritual traditions, a convergence without precedent in the world's sacred geography. For practitioners of Bon, the indigenous Tibetan tradition that predates Buddhism's arrival in the region, Kailash is the sole mountain of the entire world, the axis around which all spiritual power turns. For Tibetan Buddhists, it is the abode of the meditational deity Chakrasamvara, whose mandala the mountain physically embodies. For Hindus, it is the dwelling place of Shiva, the great ascetic god who sits in perpetual meditation on its slopes. For Jains, it is the place where the first Tirthankara, the founding teacher of their tradition, attained liberation. What is remarkable about Kailash is not merely that four traditions regard it as sacred, though that alone is worth pausing over. What is remarkable is that no mountaineering expedition has ever reached its summit. The mountain has been approached and studied and circumambulated by millions of pilgrims over many centuries, and legal restrictions on climbing currently prevent attempts. But the deeper truth is that among all those who have come close to Kailash, there has been a consistent recognition that reaching the summit is not the point. The mountain is not a problem to be solved, it is a presence to be received. The annual circumambulation of Kailash, the Kora as it is called in Tibetan, covers approximately 52 kilometers and is completed by most pilgrims over 3 days. The path crosses a high pass at approximately 5,630 meters above sea level, and in the course of the walk, the pilgrim traverses 4 distinct faces of the mountain, each associated with a different Buddhist tradition and a different quality of experience. Some pilgrims, whose devotion or whose understanding of the practice has reached a particular depth, complete the entire circumambulation by prostrating, lying full length on the ground, rising, taking 1 step forward, and lying down again for the entire 52 kilometers. This form of the kora can take several weeks. It is not understood as an extreme act. It is understood as an appropriate response to what the mountain is. The sacred mountain is not uniquely Himalayan. Sri Pada, the peak in the highland centre of Sri Lanka, known in the West as Adam's Peak, holds at its summit a rock formation that has been venerated for many centuries and continues to draw pilgrims from 4 separate religious traditions. Buddhists understand it as the footprint left by the Buddha on his 3rd visit to Sri Lanka. Hindus regard it as the footprint of Shiva. Muslims and some Christians understand it as the footprint of Adam, placed there at the moment of his descent from paradise. 4 interpretations. 1 mark in the rock, on a mountain that thousands of pilgrims climb through the night each year to reach at dawn. In Japan, Mount Fuji has been a pilgrimage destination since at least the 7th century, its near-perfect conical form visible across a vast area of the Kanto Plain and understood within Shinto belief as the physical body of a deity. The climbing of Fuji is itself a religious act, and small shrines mark the route from base to summit, each one a stopping point where the climber's relationship with the mountain is renewed and deepened. In the modern period, millions of people climb Fuji each year, many of them without any specifically religious intention, drawn simply by the form of the mountain and the quality of experience that its ascent provides. The sacred and the secular have found a way of sharing the same path. In the Nyingma school of Tibetan Buddhism, the oldest of the Tibetan Buddhist schools, certain mountains are understood as the dwelling places of powerful protective deities called Yul La, or land gods, whose relationship with the local human community is one of mutual obligation and care. The correct relationship with these mountain deities requires regular offerings, the observance of behavioral codes specific to the local landscape, and a quality of attention to the natural world that is, in practical terms, a form of ecological mindfulness refined over many centuries into precise and detailed knowledge. These traditions of sacred geography, spread across cultures and centuries and separated by vast distances of land and sea, point towards something consistent enough to be worth noting. The mountain has always been, for the contemplative mind, more than a physical object. It has been a presence, a teacher, a place where the ordinary scales of human concern are held in a perspective that only height and distance and the quality of mountain silence can provide. There is a reason that the path to a mountain monastery has never been made easier than it needs to be. Not in the traditions that built these places, not by the communities that have maintained them across centuries of use and changing conditions. The difficulty of the approach is not an accident of geography, an inconvenience that would be corrected if the means were available. It is part of what the monastery is. The body knows this, even when the mind does not. Begin climbing a long stone staircase that rises through cedar forest toward a monastery gate that is not yet visible, and something in the body begins to change. The breath deepens. The pace slows. The attention, drawn inward by the effort of the climb, and outward by the beauty and the scale of the natural world on all sides, achieves a quality of unified presence that the ordinary horizontal movement of daily life rarely produces. By the time the first gate comes into view, something has already happened that no amount of intellectual preparation could have accomplished. Many Zen monasteries in Japan are reached by exactly this kind of ascent. Long flights of moss-edged stone steps rising through old-growth forest. The trees tall enough to filter the light into something diffuse and green and quietly extraordinary. The steps are not merely a practical means of gaining elevation. They are designed, as everything in the approach sequence of a well-considered monastery is designed, to prepare the visitor's state of mind before they arrive. The walk through the forest is the first practice. The arrival at the gate is the first threshold. The monastery itself is the culmination of a journey that has been underway, in the deepest sense, since the moment the first step was taken. This understanding of the approach as practice is made explicit in many traditions. The approach path to a Tibetan monastery frequently passes through a sequence of gates or archways, each one marking a transition from a less refined to a more refined quality of space. The outermost gate stands at the boundary between the world of ordinary activity and the world of the monastery's influence. Each subsequent gate deepens the crossing, so that by the time the visitor reaches the innermost space, the main temple or shrine hall, they have made several deliberate crossings that have prepared their attention in ways that instruction alone could not achieve. In some Tibetan communities, the approach path circles the main temple complex before entering it, so that the visitor arrives having already performed the circumambulation, the clockwise walking practice called kora. That is the primary act of devotion at the site. The monastery is entered, in other words, through the very practice it houses. The boundary between approach and arrival dissolves, and the path becomes the destination in a way that is not merely metaphorical. The pilgrimage to Koyasan, the mountain monastery complex in Wakayama Prefecture, founded by Kukai in the 9th century, involves a walk through one of the most extraordinary natural environments in Japan. The inner sanctuary of Koyasan is approached through Okunoin, a forest cemetery where more than 200,000 memorial stones and grave markers stand among ancient cedar trees that are among the tallest and oldest in the country. The path through Okunoin is lined on both sides with these markers, spanning many centuries of Japanese history. The oldest stones worn almost smooth by weather, the newest still sharp-edged and legible. To walk this path is to walk through time in a physical sense, the forest receiving the visitor on one side and the dead receiving the visitor on the other. And the effect of this double reception, this being held between the living world of ancient trees and the silent world of the departed, is a quality of awareness that arrives without being summoned. The approach to Kyaiktiyo Pagoda in Myanmar, the golden rock balanced impossibly at the edge of a cliff on the slope of Mount Kyaikto, has been undertaken by Buddhist pilgrims for many centuries. The traditional 11-kilometer walk uphill was, and for many pilgrims remains, an integral part of the devotional act. The physical effort of the ascent, undertaken in the heat of Lower Myanmar, and in many cases by pilgrims who have walked much farther than 11 kilometers to reach the base of the mountain, arrives at the summit transformed into something that is difficult to describe, in terms other than lightness. The body that has worked to reach a sacred place knows something about arrival that a body delivered there effortlessly cannot. Roads have reached many mountain monasteries in the modern period that were previously accessible only on foot. The practical consequences of this change have been significant, and the communities that experienced it have responded in various ways. Some have welcomed the accessibility, understanding that practice belongs to everyone willing to undertake it, and that the physical difficulty of the traditional approach should not function as an arbitrary barrier. Others have maintained, with varying degrees of formality, something of the old discipline of approach, encouraging visitors to walk the final distance, even when a vehicle could carry them, preserving in that final walk something of what the full ascent once provided. The question underneath all of this is not really about exercise or about the preservation of tradition for its own sake. It is about what happens to the mind when the body has worked for something. What quality of attention arrives with a person who has climbed for 3 hours compared to a person who has been delivered to the same gate by a smooth and effortless conveyance? The mountain monasteries have always known the answer, and they have built their approaches accordingly. A mountain does not experience time the way the valley below it does. Not because time moves differently at altitude, though there is a physical sense in which it does, relativity being the extraordinary thing that it is, but because the markers by which time is measured in the mountain world are different from those of the world below. Down in the valley, time is measured by clocks and calendars, by the rhythms of commerce and institution, by the succession of obligations that organize an ordinary week. On the mountain, time is measured by weather, by light, by the particular quality of cold on a particular morning, and by the sounds that change as one season yields to the next. Mountain weather is not merely variable, it is, at altitude, one of the dominant facts of existence, a condition that shapes everything from the structure of buildings to the organization of the daily schedule to the quality of attention available for practice on a given day. The communities that have inhabited mountain monasteries for centuries have developed detailed and precisely calibrated knowledge of their local meteorological conditions, knowledge that is not written in any meteorological text, but that lives in the bodies of people who have paid close attention to the same mountain over many years. Reading the behavior of clouds in the afternoon to anticipate a storm overnight. Noticing the direction and quality of the wind in the early morning as an indication of what the day will hold. Observing the behavior of birds and the particular sound of the wind through the monastery's corridors as signs of approaching or departing weather. This knowledge, accumulated across generations of careful observation, constitutes a form of environmental literacy that is as precise in its own domain as any academic discipline, and that has kept communities safe and prepared in conditions where the margin for error was genuinely thin. The monsoon determines the rhythm of Buddhist practice across the South and Southeast Asian world, with a completeness that no institution has ever successfully overridden. The Theravada rain retreat, called Vasa in the Pali language that preserves the tradition's earliest texts, begins at the full moon of July and lasts for 3 months, following a schedule established by the Buddha himself in response to a practical problem. During the monsoon, travel across waterlogged paths through fields and forests results in the accidental destruction of crops and the killing of the small creatures that flood conditions bring to the surface of the soil. To avoid this inadvertent harm, monks were required to remain in one location for the duration of the rains, and the 3-month retreat that resulted became one of the most structurally significant features of the Theravada monastic year. Above the monsoon belt, in the high Himalayan regions of Tibet and Bhutan and Ladakh, the seasonal logic is different but equally absolute. Winter at altitude brings months of snowfall and temperatures that make sustained outdoor activity genuinely dangerous. Communities in these regions have always maintained substantial food stores, carefully assembled through the more generous months of summer and autumn, sufficient to carry the monastery through the severest winter without requiring supply from outside. The calculation involved in this provisioning, knowing how many people the stores must feed, for how long, and through what quality of cold, is one of the forms of practical wisdom that mountain monastery life has always required. Within this enforced stillness, the great winter retreats of the Tibetan tradition take their character partly from the conditions that surround them. When the snow has closed the paths and the monastery is effectively alone in the landscape, the interior quality of the practice deepens in ways that summer practice, with its easier movement and its connections to the world below, cannot quite replicate. The community is returned to itself, to its own silence and its own resources, and within that return, something becomes available that abundance and accessibility naturally obscure. Spring's arrival in the mountain monastery world is not a gradual softening. It is a sequence of distinct events, each one noticed and honoured by a community that has been paying close attention to the mountain's behaviour for months. The first day that the south-facing courtyard wall holds warmth long enough to sit against it in the afternoon. The first morning that the water in the cistern has not frozen overnight. The first bird calls from below the tree line, carried up on warmer air to the monastery's walls. These are not incidental details of the season's turning. They are, in the understanding of communities that live close to the mountain's rhythms, teachings delivered in the mountain's own language. The Thangka paintings stored rolled during the cold months are brought out and unrolled in the spring warmth for their annual airing and display, some of them measuring 20 meters or more in length, unfurled on the south-facing wall of the monastery as an act of revelation that is also an act of maintenance, the paintings breathing in the season's returning air. The sight of these vast sacred images against the stone walls of a mountain monastery, the colours dense and luminous against the pale rock, the valley far below still in the last of winter's shadow, is one of the experiences that those who have seen it tend to carry for the rest of their lives. The morning bell sounds in a mountain monastery before the light has found the valley below, and in the cold dark of the dormitories, the sound does not so much wake the monks as confirm that wakefulness has already begun. The body learns, over years of this rhythm, to rise at the sound rather than toward it, the boundary between sleep and waking, becoming with practice as clear and clean as the line between the mountain's shadow and the sky above it. In Tibetan monasteries, the pre-dawn cold is one of the first teachers of the day, and it is a teacher that does not soften its lessons. Stone floors that have not been warmed by the sun receive the feet with a directness that cannot be misunderstood. The robe that is wrapped around the body in the first minutes after rising is not merely clothing. It is the body's first statement of the day, a gathering of the self against the cold that the mountain provides without negotiation, a preparation for the session of chanting and meditation that begins before the sky has begun to lighten. The standard drink of Tibetan monastic life, butter tea, called pocha in the Tibetan language, is not a beverage that reveals its qualities to the unfamiliar palate immediately. Made from tea, yak butter and salt, combined in a churn until the fat is fully incorporated and the mixture becomes thick and warming, it provides the substantial calories and dietary fat that the body requires to sustain itself at altitude in cold conditions. For those who have lived in the high Himalayan monasteries for years, it is the taste of morning, of community, of the particular warmth that a shared cup generates when the world outside the kitchen is still frozen and dark. The yak butter that goes into the tea also serves as the fuel for the butter lamps that burn before the altars and sacred images in the shrine halls of every Tibetan monastery. These small flames, which in large monasteries may number in the hundreds, and which burn continuously through the day and night, fill the shrine hall with a warmth and a particular soft light that has no equivalent in modern illumination. The smoke of hundreds of butter lamps over many years darkens the ceiling of a shrine hall and deposits on the painted surfaces a patina of devotion that is itself a kind of record, as legible to those who know how to read it as any written document. Debate in the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism is not an academic exercise conducted in a quiet room between carefully composed scholars. It is a physical practice, undertaken in open courtyards in all weathers, involving one monk seated on the ground while another stands before them, posing questions with a stylized vocabulary of gestures and footwork that gives the practice a quality of energetic directness, quite unlike the restrained exchanges of scholarly seminar. The standing debater's clap of the hands at the moment of making a point, the step forward with the right foot, the outstretched arm. These are the physical language of a tradition that understands the engagement with ideas as requiring the full participation of the body, not merely the mind. And in a cold courtyard at altitude, the physical energy of the debate generates warmth as a practical byproduct, the practice sustaining the body as it challenges the intellect. The practice calendar of a Tibetan monastery organizes the year into intensive and ordinary periods, with a clarity that gives the community's life a seasonal rhythm as distinct as the mountain's own. Major festivals correspond to the lunar calendar and involve the entire community in days of continuous ceremonial activity. The preparation of offering structures, the construction of elaborate butter sculptures called torma, the performance of ritual masked dances called cham in the monastery courtyard. These festivals are not interruptions of the practice. They are intensifications of it, periods when the community's accumulated intention becomes visible in collective action, and the monastery opens itself to the surrounding community in a way that the ordinary rhythm of monastic life does not require. The position of the sun over the mountain ridges that surround the monastery serves, for those who have spent years attending to it, as a natural clock of considerable precision. A senior monk with decades of experience in a particular mountain location knows, from the quality of light on a specific wall, or the angle at which shadow falls across a particular courtyard stone, what hour of the day it is within a margin of perhaps 15 minutes. This knowledge is not learned from a book. It is absorbed slowly through the practice of paying attention to the same place across many seasons, until the relationship between the light and the time becomes as legible as the face of a clock. The mountain teaches it, patiently and without explanation, to anyone willing to pay attention for long enough. The creation of sacred art in a mountain monastery is a form of practice so deeply embedded in the tradition that the boundary between making and meditating becomes, for those trained in it, effectively invisible. A monk who has completed years of study in the iconographic standards of a particular tradition, learning the precise proportions of the Buddha's form as described in canonical texts, memorizing the symbolic attributes of each deity and bodhisattva, studying the colors associated with specific qualities of awakened mind, and then sitting in meditation before beginning to paint, is not producing an illustration. They are performing a practice whose outcome happens to take a visible form. The Thangka painting tradition of Tibet and the Himalayan region has maintained its iconographic precision across approximately 1,000 years of continuous practice. The ground is cotton or silk, sized with a mixture of chalk and animal glue, and then polished smooth with a rounded stone. The pigments are minerals ground to precise consistencies, mixed with organic binders whose formulation varies by school and master. The gold used for outlines and highlights, which in a well-made thangka can occupy a significant portion of the visual field, is genuine ground gold leaf applied with a fine brush and burnished to a high shine with a smooth stone or crystal. The finished work, in the hands of a trained painter working at full capacity, is not merely beautiful. It is a precision instrument for the cultivation of specific qualities of awareness in the practitioner who uses it as a meditation support. Sand mandalas represent perhaps the most extraordinary combination of artistic precision and philosophical commitment in the world's contemplative traditions. A team of monks working with metal funnels called chak pur, whose vibration releases a thin stream of colored sand, construct over the course of days or weeks an intricate geometric design representing the palace of a specific awakened being, every line and measurement governed by texts and by the training of the practitioners who have committed those texts to memory. The mandala that emerges from this process, when it is fully complete, may contain thousands of individual elements rendered in colors of extraordinary delicacy against the white background of a table or platform. And then, when the completion ritual has been performed and the prayers have been offered and the meaning of the construction has been fully received, the monks sweep the sand from the outside of the mandala toward its center, in a motion that is simultaneously an act of ritual completion and a physical demonstration of the teaching that the mandala embodies. Everything that arises passes. Everything constructed dissolves. The sand is carried to a nearby body of water and released into the current, carrying its accumulated intention outward into the world in all directions. The monks return to their rooms. The table is bare. The practice is complete. The prayer flags that string between the peaks and walls of Himalayan mountain monasteries are among the most visually distinctive features of the landscape, and their meaning is more precise than their festive appearance suggests. printed with prayers, mantras, and images of the Lungta, the wind horse that carries blessings across the sky. They are not addressed to any deity. They are instruments of dispersal, releasing their printed intentions into the wind that carries them in all directions across the mountain world. The wind is not merely a meteorological phenomenon in this understanding. It is a medium of transmission, a carrier of benefit that the flags engage and direct with every movement. The prayer flags are renewed each Tibetan New Year, called Losar, as faded flags are understood to have completed their work, having released their prayers fully into the wind over the preceding year. The faded flags are not discarded into the refuse. They are treated with the same respect given to any sacred object, burned or placed in moving water, their dissolution handled with attention rather than convenience. This small act of care, performed annually and without any audience, is characteristic of the attention that the sacred object traditions of these mountain communities bring to the entire material world of their practice. The great prayer wheels found outside Himalayan monasteries, and in smaller versions inside shrine rooms, and in the hands of walking practitioners throughout the Himalayan world, are cylinders filled with densely printed rolls of mantra text, spun clockwise by the hands of anyone who passes. The understanding behind the practice is that each complete rotation of the wheel carries the benefit of having recited all the mantras contained within it, a multiplication of intention that makes the brief, almost casual turning of a hand in passing into an act of considerable practice significance. Some of the great prayer wheels in major Tibetan monasteries are large enough to require several people to turn them, and the sound of their rotation, a deep, rhythmic turning that fills the entrance courtyard of the monastery, is one of the characteristic sounds of the Himalayan sacred landscape. Before stone was cut and mortar mixed, before the great monastery complexes of Tibet and China and Japan began to take their characteristic forms, the practitioner who sought deep contemplative work went to a cave, not as a romantic gesture towards simplicity, but because a cave offered what the contemplative life required in its most concentrated form: shelter, silence, darkness, distance from the ordinary world sufficient to make the mind's own movements visible against the background of reduced external stimulation. The cave holds a place of particular honor in the Himalayan Buddhist tradition, not as a historical relic of a more primitive period, but as the original and most direct form of the monastic dwelling, the place where the tradition's greatest practitioners did their most transformative work. To meditate in a cave where a realized teacher once sat is not merely to occupy the same physical space. It is, in the understanding of these traditions, to enter a field of accumulated intention that the practice of the previous inhabitant has made denser and more available than it was before. Milarepa, the 11th century Tibetan yogi, whose life story has been read and sung and memorized across the Himalayan world for 9 centuries, spent years in mountain caves in conditions of austerity so complete that modern readers of his biography sometimes struggle to believe they are reading a historical account rather than a myth. He wore a single white cotton robe through the winters of the high Himalaya, ate nettles when food was not brought to him, and sat in the darkness of mountain caves in a practice of such intensity that the walls of those caves, according to the tradition, still hold an imprint of his presence that sensitive practitioners can perceive. The caves associated with Milarepa and with the other great teachers of the Tibetan tradition are maintained as pilgrimage sites, visited by practitioners who come not merely to pay respect to the memory of the teacher, but to meditate in a place where the qualities they are trying to develop were demonstrated at full intensity. The rock surfaces of these cave interiors are smooth, where centuries of hands have touched them. The walls are dark with the soot of butter lamps lit by the thousands who came before. The air inside them holds a quality that those who have sat in them describe in similar terms: a condensed stillness, a sense that something is very present, something that is not ghost or spirit, but rather the accumulated weight of a great deal of genuine practice, performed in one small space over a very long time. The hermitage, called Krod in Tibetan, is the institutionalized form of the cave-dwelling tradition, a small structure of one or a few rooms built at high altitude specifically for solitary retreat, connected to a larger monastery at a lower elevation that supplies the hermit with the minimal food required for survival. The supply monk, who carries food up to the hermitage at regular intervals, performs a role that is itself understood as a form of service practice. The physical labor of the ascent and the quiet, non-intrusive care that the role requires constituting a genuine practice in support of the hermit's more interior one. Among the most revered hermitage traditions of the Zen world, the mountain complex of Eiheiji in the mountains of Fukui Prefecture stands as the living expression of the teaching of Dogen Zenji, the 13th century Japanese master who understood the natural world itself as the expression of the Dharma. Dogen chose the remote mountain valley of Eiheiji precisely for its distance from the centers of cultural and political activity, writing that the mountains themselves were practicing alongside any practitioner who sat among them. The community he founded there has maintained continuous practice for more than 7 centuries, the same early mornings and the same late evenings, the same cold corridors and the same forested approaches, generation after generation, bringing the same quality of attention to the same quiet mountain valley. The practice called Dhutanga in the Theravada tradition of Thailand allows forest monks to undertake a form of wandering contemplative life that the Buddha himself is recorded as having practiced and recommended. The 13 austerities of Dhutanga include living under trees, in mountain forests, or in caves rather than in fixed monasteries, eating only from the alms bowl and only once a day, wearing robes made only from discarded cloth, and sitting in meditation rather than lying down for sleep. Monks who practice Dhutanga, called Tudong monks in the Thai tradition, move through the forests of Thailand and into the hill country near the borders with Myanmar and Laos, in a rhythm that follows the rainy season and the paths of the forest rather than any institutional schedule. They are, in their wandering, one of the living connections between the contemporary practice world and the conditions under which the tradition first developed. The dark retreat, a practice of the Tibetan Dzogchen tradition in which a practitioner spends weeks or months in complete darkness in a purpose-built light-proof room, represents the most radical reduction of external experience to the support of interior practice. Some of the mountain hermitages of Tibet and Bhutan have maintained these light-proof retreat chambers for centuries, carved into the rock of the mountainside, or built into the structure of the hermitage building. The practitioner who enters the dark retreat room does so only after years of preparatory practice and with the guidance of a teacher who has made the same journey, and they emerge after the prescribed period with what the tradition describes as an irreversible change in the relationship between awareness and the phenomena that arise within it. There is a kind of silence at altitude that is not the same as the silence of a quiet room. The quiet room is silent because the sounds that ordinarily fill it have been removed, and in their absence the room waits, somewhat emptied, for them to return. The silence of a high mountain is different. It is not the removal of something. It is the presence of something that the noise of lower elevations obscures. A quality of acoustic openness that receives whatever sounds arise with a clarity and an evenness that the layered sounds of inhabited valleys do not provide. Into this silence, the musical traditions of the Himalayan mountain monasteries introduce sounds that are among the most extraordinary produced by human instruments anywhere in the world. The dungchen, the Tibetan longhorn, consists of copper and brass sections that telescope from a compact stored form to a plain length of several meters. It is played in pairs from monastery gateways and rooftops at significant points in the liturgical calendar, the two horns sounding together in a low, resonant, overlapping drone that carries across mountain valleys with an ease that no smaller instrument can approach. Those who have heard the dungchen sounded from a monastery rooftop at dawn, its tones moving across a valley still in morning mist, describe an experience that the word sound does not quite adequately contain. The Tibetan oboe, called gyalong in the Tibetan language, produces by contrast a bright and penetrating call that functions in the ceremonial context to open the attention of all present and to summon the awareness of the protective presences of the local landscape. Played from the monastery roof, its sound radiates outward across the surrounding mountain world in all directions, and the tradition understands this radiation literally, the sound carrying the signal of the ceremony's opening to beings whose attention it is appropriate to invite. The conch shell trumpet, called dungdakar in Tibetan, its name combining the words for trumpet and for white, the colour of the particular species of shell used in the tradition, produces a sound that carries the quality of all sounds simultaneously, a richness of overtone that gives even a single note a quality of fullness that few manufactured instruments achieve. The conch trumpet is used at significant transitions in Tibetan Buddhist ceremonies, and its sound is associated with the spreading of the teachings in all directions, just as the sound itself radiates outward from the shell that holds it. At altitude, in the acoustic openness of mountain air, the conch's tone travels with a range and a clarity that the same instrument played indoors cannot produce. The paired ritual implements of Vajrayana practice, the bell called drilbu and the thunderbolt scepter called dorje, are held in the hands of practitioners during certain categories of ceremony. The bell is held in the left hand and represents the quality of wisdom. The thunderbolt is held in the right hand and represents the quality of skillful means. The ringing of the bell during the ceremony marks specific transitions in the ritual's structure and produces a tone of particular purity, a sound that the tradition understands as the voice of the teaching itself, arising and passing in the silence of the shrine hall with the same quality of presence and impermanence that the teaching describes. Mountain wind passing through the corridors and courtyards of a high-altitude monastery is not a constant. Its character varies with the season, with the hour, and with the condition of the building it moves through. And those who have lived in one mountain monastery for many years develop a relationship with the wind sounds that functions as a kind of ambient information system. The particular quality of the wind's sound, through the narrow gap between two specific buildings, tells an experienced resident something about the direction and strength of the wind that is coming. The sound of wind through the prayer flags on the roof carries information about the weather that is approaching. The deep resonance that old stone walls produce in certain wind conditions is a sound that has been part of the monastery's life for centuries, as familiar to long-term residents as any bell. The tradition in several Himalayan schools of following the sound of the monastery bell with full attention into the silence that receives it, treating the decay of the tone as a meditation object in itself, represents one of the most refined applications of sound in the contemplative life. The bell is struck, and the sound arises. It reaches its fullest intensity and then begins, very slowly, to diminish. It does not stop. It fades, the vibration becoming subtler and subtler until the point where it becomes impossible to say whether the sound is still present or whether what one is attending to is the memory of a sound, the mind's trace of something that has already passed into silence. That edge between the sound and the silence that receives it is the meditation object. And learning to stay at that edge, to maintain attention there without grasping at the sound or rushing into the silence, is one of the more delicate practices that the monastery's bells support. There is a statement in the Zen tradition that a practitioner encounters early and understands in successive stages of depth for the rest of their life. Mountains are mountains. Mountains are not mountains. Mountains are mountains again. In the first stage, the mountain is exactly what it appears to be: solid, large, unmistakably real, the most stable seeming thing in the landscape. The view from the monastery window or the hermitage door is of something that has always been there, in much the same form, and that will continue to be there long after the person looking at it has become part of the earth that the mountain stands on. In the second stage, the mountain's solidity becomes questionable. The practice of looking carefully at the nature of experience reveals that the mountain's apparent self-evidence, its thingness, is a construction of the mind that perceives it rather than a property that the mountain itself possesses independently. The mountain, like everything else that appears to be fixed and real and permanent, turns out, on careful examination, to be empty of the inherent existence that ordinary perception attributes to it. This is not the pleasant discovery that it might sound like in summary. It is, for the practitioner encountering it fully, a genuinely disorienting experience, the most stable seeming things in the world suddenly revealing themselves to be far more contingent and far less solid than they appeared. In the third stage, the mountain is a mountain again. But it is seen now with the understanding of the second stage intact within the seeing, not as a qualification that reduces the mountain's reality, but as a depth that increases it. The mountain is fully present, fully itself, and no longer burdened with the solidity that the mind's ordinary projection laid upon it. It is lighter in this third understanding, more vivid, more genuinely itself than the first, naive perception could accommodate. Dogen Zenji, writing in 13th century Japan, produced in his essay Sansuikyo, the Mountains and Waters Sutra, one of the most extraordinary philosophical treatments of the natural world in any contemplative tradition. In Dogen's understanding, the mountains and rivers and great earth are not objects that awakened practitioners observe and reflect upon. They are themselves the expression of awakened activity, walking and flowing and standing in a manner that transcends the ordinary categories of motion and stillness. To walk in the mountains, in Dogen's understanding, is to walk alongside a being that is also walking, in a different timescale and by a different means, but with no less genuine and no less present an activity than the practitioner's own. The Tibetan concept of drala, sometimes translated as above energy or energy beyond aggression, refers to a quality of sacredness understood to be inherent in wild and untamed natural places. Mountain summits, large rivers, ancient trees, and the open sky at altitude are among the places where drala is most available to perception. Not because it is more present there, but because the conditions are closer to those required for its recognition. The perceiving mind must be quiet enough, open enough, and sufficiently free from the habitual activity of protecting and managing and narrating itself to receive what is already present. The mountain does not generate the drala. The mountain offers the conditions in which it can be perceived. The concept of ma, in Japanese aesthetic understanding, often translated as negative space or interval, carries particular weight in the context of mountain monastery architecture. The spaces between buildings, the views framed by gates and doorways, the relationship between the constructed forms of the monastery and the unconstructible forms of the mountain that surrounds it, are considered in the design of these complexes with the same precision and the same intentionality that is brought to the buildings themselves. What is not built is understood to be as significant as what is. The silence between notes is understood to be as significant as the notes. The mountain behind the monastery wall is not background. It is present, and it is part of what the monastery is teaching at every moment of every day. Several masters in both the Zen and the Tibetan traditions have described the mountain as a natural embodiment of qualities that the practitioner is simultaneously trying to develop through deliberate practice. The combination of complete stillness and complete openness. A mountain moves on the timescales that are relevant to its nature, with a slowness that is effectively stillness to the human perception. And yet, the mountain is not closed. It receives rain, wind, snow, the roots of plants and the weight of buildings and the footsteps of pilgrims. It does not resist or select or react. It simply receives, holds for a time, and remains itself. This combination of unwavering stability and total receptivity is, in the language of most contemplative traditions, a description of the quality of mind that practice is meant to cultivate. The mountain demonstrates it without trying and without stopping. A mountain monastery is not the world, but it is not separate from the world either. The communities that have built and maintained these places across centuries understood this with a clarity that the more romantic portrayals of monastic life tend to obscure. The monastery exists in a relationship with the world below it, receiving from that world the support, the students, the cultural inheritance, and the practical resources without which no institution survives, and returning to that world in the form of practice, learning, art, and the maintenance of tradition, something that the world below cannot easily produce on its own terms. The Tibetan monasteries that the political upheavals of 1959 forced into exile demonstrate this relationship's resilience with particular force. Sera Monastery, one of the three great Gelugpa monasteries near Lhasa, had been in continuous operation in its mountain location since the 15th century. When a significant portion of its community relocated to Karnataka in southern India, they carried with them not buildings or libraries, which could not be moved, but something more portable and more durable: a living lineage. The unbroken transmission of teachers and students, of texts memorized in the body rather than stored on a shelf, of practices that lived in the cells of those who had spent years doing them. The reconstructed Sera in Karnataka, now home to thousands of monks, maintains the full curriculum of the original institution in a climate radically different from the Tibetan highlands, at an altitude of perhaps 900 meters rather than 3,700. The practice, it turns out, travels. The mountain does not. The monasteries of the Nepal Himalaya, particularly those of the Solu Khumbu region in the shadow of the high peaks, have been navigating the consequences of Western mountaineering's discovery of Everest and its neighbours since the 1950s. The economic transformation has been real and complex, bringing material resources and infrastructure to communities that previously had little access to either, while also introducing rates of change that the traditional monastic institution was not designed to absorb quickly. The monastery of Tengbosha, at approximately 3,167 meters above sea level, with one of the most extraordinary mountain views available from any monastery in the world, was destroyed by fire in 1989 and rebuilt through an international effort that included contributions from the mountaineering community that considers the monastery an inseparable part of the experience of approaching the high peaks. The rebuilt monastery is a collaboration between the traditional and the modern, between the local community and the wider world that has found its way to this high and beautiful place. Bhutan's approach to the tensions between the traditional monastic world and the pressures of modern tourism offers one carefully considered model for how these questions can be managed. The policy of high-value, low-impact tourism that Bhutan has maintained since the 1970s, requiring a significant minimum daily expenditure from foreign visitors and limiting overall visitor numbers, was developed in part specifically to protect the cultural and religious character of sites that include the country's mountain monasteries. The result is a country whose ancient monastic institutions remain, as of the present time, living centers of practice rather than museum exhibits, and whose mountain landscapes retain a quality of wildness and quietness that more accessible regions have long since lost. In China, several of the great Buddhist mountain monastery complexes have been developed as significant cultural tourism destinations. The four sacred mountains, Wutai, Emei, Jiuhua, and Putuo, now receive millions of visitors each year, a number that the ancient pilgrimage roads were not designed to accommodate. The challenge of maintaining genuine practice within institutions that are simultaneously national heritage sites, tourist destinations, and living monastic communities is one that the Chinese Buddhist establishment navigates continuously, with varying degrees of success depending on the specific site and the character of its resident community. The monastery libraries of the mountain tradition have functioned across many periods of political instability in the regions below them as repositories of knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. The Bhutanese monasteries preserved manuscript traditions, medical knowledge, and artistic techniques that survived invasions and upheaval in neighboring Tibet by virtue of Bhutan's geographic remoteness and its unbroken institutional continuity. The transmission of knowledge requires continuity of institution, and the institutions of the mountain world, protected by altitude and by the practical difficulty of reaching them, have provided that continuity in circumstances where more accessible institutions could not. What the mountain monastery has always offered the world below it is not primarily books or buildings, or even the practitioners it trains, though all of these matter enormously. What it has offered, in the deepest sense, is a demonstration. A demonstration that a human life can be organized around the cultivation of awareness with a consistency and a depth that ordinary life, without the monastery's structure and its distance from distraction, rarely achieves. The mountain holds the monastery holds the demonstration. And the demonstration, whether or not anyone is watching, continues. There is something that old stone holds that new stone does not, and it is not only the memory of the hands that shaped it. It is the slow accumulation of time itself, made visible in the patina of weather on an exposed surface, in the smoothness worn into a threshold stone by the passage of thousands of feet, in the particular darkness of a shrine hall ceiling above the place where butter lamps have burned for several centuries. Old stone is a record, not the kind of record that can be read with ordinary literacy, but a record nonetheless, and one that communicates to the body in ways that the mind does not require words to receive. Mountain stone has a thermal quality that no modern insulating material quite replicates. It absorbs heat slowly, the way the body absorbs warmth in the presence of a fire, not immediately and not fully, but with a gradual and pervasive completeness. In the mountain monastery, the thick stone walls cool late into the morning, long after the sun has been up for hours, and hold whatever warmth the afternoon sun has given them well into the cold of the evening. The body that has lived alongside these walls for years knows this rhythm intimately, knows which corner of the courtyard will be warm by mid-morning, which wall will hold that warmth longest into the evening, which threshold catches the last of the sun's heat on a cold autumn day. The tradition of carving Buddhist scriptures and imagery onto the surface of exposed rock is one of the most characteristic and most ancient forms of sacred expression in the Himalayan world. The Mani walls of Ladakh, long rows of flat stones carved with the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, the mantra of Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva whose quality is compassion and who is understood as the patron of Tibet, extend in some locations for hundreds of meters along paths and roadsides. The accumulation of these carved stones over many centuries, each one placed by a specific human hand as a specific act of devotion, creates a record of religious life that is as extensive as any written archive and considerably more durable. The mantra Om Mani Padme Hum, which translates loosely as the jewel in the lotus, is the most widely recited mantra in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. Its 6 syllables are each associated with one of the 6 realms of existence described in Buddhist cosmology, and the aspiration carried in the recitation is for the liberation of all beings in all realms. Each stone carved with these syllables and placed on a mani wall is therefore an act of universal compassion, expressed in the simplest possible physical form: a flat stone, a few carved letters, placed with care on a wall that will outlast the hand that placed it by many centuries. The geological history of the Himalayas is itself, when attended to, a teaching of the kind that the contemplative traditions have always sought in the natural world. Marine fossils, the compressed remains of creatures that lived in an ancient ocean, have been found in Himalayan rock at elevations of more than 5,000 meters, evidence of the movement of the Earth's plates over millions of years that lifted the ocean floor into the highest mountains in the world. Several Tibetan Buddhist teachers have pointed to this fact not as a curiosity, but as a direct perception of impermanence on a scale that dwarfs the ordinary human experience of change and loss. The ocean that covered these mountains was not an allegory. It was here. The mountains that now stand where it was are not permanent. They too are in motion, on timescales that the human mind can understand intellectually, but that require the mountains themselves to teach experientially. The lichens that grow on the stone surfaces of mountain monasteries, advancing by less than a millimeter in some species over the course of a year, are among the most patient timekeepers available to those who know how to read them. A thick crust of lichen on a surface of old monastery stone is a record of age that does not require documentation or interpretation. It is the thing itself, the passage of decades and centuries made visible in the slow, grey-green testimony of an organism that has no relationship with human calendars and no reason to hurry. What endures, in the end, is not the stone, though the stone endures for a very long time. What endures is the practice, the understanding that the stone was quarried and shaped and carried up a mountain to house, the awareness that the walls were built thick enough to hold heat through winter and to stand against wind that had crossed 1,000 kilometers of plateau before it arrived at the monastery's outer face. The knowledge that the butter lamps burning in the shrine hall tonight are burning in the same darkness where butter lamps have burned for many hundreds of years, their light no different in its quality from the light they replaced, the darkness around them no different either, the practice that they illuminate continuous from the beginning to now and forward into times that no one currently living will see. Mountain monasteries built from local stone are, in the most literal sense, part of the mountain itself. The walls rose from the rock beneath them, shaped by human hands and human intention, and they will, given sufficient time and the abandonment of human maintenance, return to it. What is built and what it is built from are not ultimately separate, a fact that is not accidental in traditions where the dissolution of fixed boundaries between self and other, between inside and outside, between the practitioner and the place of practice, is among the central insights toward which all the training, all the bells, all the cold early mornings, and all the long patient years are pointing. The view from a mountain monastery at dawn, when mist fills the valley below, and the peaks rise above it into a sky that is still more dark than light, places the ordinary world in a perspective that the ordinary world, seen from inside itself, cannot achieve for itself. Down in the valley, the world is everything. Every concern is immediate, Every scale is human. Every problem is at arm's length. From the monastery window, the valley is held quietly at a distance that does not diminish it but clarifies it, the way stepping back from a painting clarifies what the painter was doing. The world is still there, fully present and fully real. It is simply for a moment receivable. And that quality of reception, that willingness to hold what is present without grasping it and without pushing it away, is what the mountain has been teaching in its quiet and unhurried way, since before the first stone was ever placed upon another. As we come gently to the end of our time among the mountains and the monasteries, let everything settle for a moment before it fades. There is no need to hold any of it tightly. The mind will keep what it needs, the way a stone wall keeps the warmth of an afternoon, long after the sun has moved behind the ridge. We began high above the noise of the ordinary world, in those places that the contemplative traditions of Asia chose with care and inhabited with patience across 2,000 years of unbroken practice. We walked through the reasoning behind the choice, the practical wisdom of altitude and isolation, and the reliable clarity of mountain water, and beneath that reasoning, the deeper understanding that certain landscapes carry qualities that support the inner life in ways that flatter terrain cannot provide. Mountains were not merely convenient, they were participants, they were teachers, they were chosen because they were already doing something that the practice sought to learn. We stood inside the architecture of those high places, walls of stone cut from the mountain itself and carried upward by the slow patience of human hands, monasteries that grew from the rock beneath them and that hold, in their thick walls and their careful proportions, centuries of accumulated intention. We sat with the cold of the pre-dawn hours, the butter tea warming hands that had just risen from a sleeping mat on a stone floor, the breath visible in the lamplight before the first chanting of the day had begun. We followed the pilgrims up the long stone staircases through cedar forests, through the sequence of gates that prepared the mind, step by step, for the quality of arrival that the monastery was waiting to offer. We circled the sacred mountains that 4 traditions have returned to across the span of recorded human history, each tradition finding in the same high places a different expression of the same recognition. That height offers perspective. That distance from the noise of the valleys offers the conditions in which the mind's own nature becomes observable. That the mountain, in its combination of absolute stillness and absolute openness, demonstrates something that the practitioner is simultaneously trying to understand from the inside. We listened to the deep resonance of the long horn moving across a valley in morning mist, and to the silence that the bell leaves behind when its tone has become too subtle for ordinary hearing to follow. We sat in the caves where the tradition's greatest practitioners did their most transformative work, walls darkened by centuries of butter lamp smoke, rock surfaces smoothed by the hands of those who came after, to receive what the practice of those early inhabitants had made available in the stone itself. We touched the mani stones, each one a flat piece of mountain rock carved with syllables of universal compassion and placed by a specific human hand on a wall that will outlast it by centuries. We followed the prayer flags in the wind between the mountain peaks, carrying their intentions in all directions across the high places, where the ordinary and the extraordinary are not separated by anything more substantial than a quality of attention. And underneath all of it, running like the snow-melt stream that runs beneath the monastery's oldest walls, was one continuous understanding: that the mountain does not perform its teachings. It simply is what it is, fully and without remainder, and in that complete self-sufficiency, it demonstrates, for those quiet and present enough to receive it, exactly what the practice has always been pointing toward. There is something in all of this that asks nothing of you tonight. Not belief, not commitment, not any particular response. It only suggests, in the way that a mountain suggests rather than instructs, that the stillness these traditions sought in their high and quiet places is not absent from wherever you are right now. It is here, underneath the day's residue, waiting with the patience that mountains have always had in abundance. If these slow journeys into sleep bring you something worth returning to, you are warmly welcome to leave a like, or subscribe to the Sleepy Mind, or leave a quiet thought in the comments below. This channel exists because of the people who find something worth coming back to in these unhurried evenings together, and each one who finds their way here makes it a little easier for the next tired and curious mind to find it too. And if sleep has not yet arrived, there is another gentle journey waiting on the screen, another quiet door into a slow and interesting world, ready whenever you are. But if your eyes are heavy now, let them close. Let the mountains recede the way mountains recede at dusk, not disappearing, but softening, their edges becoming less distinct, their forms settling into the darkening sky until they are more feeling than image, more presence than shape. Let your shoulders release whatever they have been holding through the day. Let your jaw unclench. Let your hands rest exactly where they are, as still as stones that have been in the same place for a very long time. The day is done. The bell has sounded for the last time tonight. Somewhere above the clouds, a butter lamp is burning in a stone hall that has held that flame for centuries. The flame does not know this. The stone does not know this. The darkness around the flame simply receives it, as darkness always has, without preference and without resistance. You can rest in the same way now. Let the breath continue on its own, slow and even and completely without effort. The same breath that has carried you through every moment of your life, asking nothing in return except that you allow it to continue. Allow it to continue now. Sleep well and good night.